The following talk is offered freely to ensure that no one is ever denied access to these practices and to these teachings. If you feel inspired to make a donation to support this offering, you can go to my website at jonathanfoust.com. While you're there, you can also sign up for a monthly newsletter designed to support you in your practice. Thank you, and enjoy.
So how can you tell if someone is vegan at a dinner party? Don't worry, they'll tell you. There are a lot of nasty vegan jokes out there. There's a lot of resentment toward vegans. Just as in meditation and spiritual practices, there are plenty of people out there who are primed and ready to tell you how their technique and their tradition is the best. And I say this from some experience with 35 years of being pretty deeply immersed in different techniques and different trainings. And it's the same thing when it comes to diet and approach to diet. And I've experimented with a lot of different approaches and philosophies as well. I grew up with the standard American diet and the macrobiotic diet, the raw food diet, the living food diet, the Ayurvedic diet, intermittent fasting, the blood type diet, the maker's diet, the zone diet, and even tried on my father's approach, which he called the seafood diet, where you'd seafood and eat it. That was pretty much his approach. But I'm fascinated by this relationship between food and consciousness. I'm not a nutritionist. I'm not an expert. So anything I say here you can take with a grain of Gamazio, if you know what Gamazio is. A disclaimer, not making any endorsements or recommendations. Please consult your physician or health advisor before beginning any new dietary regime. But I did want to talk about what is spiritual eating, or eating as a spiritual practice. I'd like to talk about sort of the rituals that we have around food. How, just as in meditation, self-awareness is your guide. And to talk about some strategies on what and how you eat. And then I'd also like to talk about the Buddhist principle of non-harming. And what does that mean for you as you explore finding a diet and eating as a spiritual practice for yourself? And it's different for all of us. So there's so many different rituals around food. One story I've always loved is this young mother was making roast beef, and she cut the ends off, the cut of roast beef before putting it in the pan. And her daughter said, "Mommy, why do you do that? Why do you cut the ends off the roast beef?" And she said, "My mother always did it that way. Well, let's ask her." And so they next time they were with the grandmother, they said, "Why is it that you cut the ends off the roast beef?" And she said, I'm not sure. That's how my mother taught me to do it. So it just turns out that the great-grandma was alive. And I said, "Why is it that you cut both ends off the roast beef?" And she said, I never had a pan big enough for the cut of meat. We just take on these rituals, and sometimes they're not conscious, and sometimes they can be in really powerful ways. The ways you ritualize food as a practice for yourself. So in Africa, you always eat with the right hand, not with the left hand. In Thailand, you use your fork to push your food onto a spoon. In Japan, you slurp your noodles. That's a sign that you appreciate what you're eating. In South Korea, is the oldest who eats first as part of the ritual. I didn't know this, but someone said on the internet, so it must be true. that in China you never flip a fish when you cook it. It's sort of like a boat flipping over, so it's bad luck. The tea ritual in Japan, the tea ritual in Great Britain, where you never let your spoon touch the side of the cup. In Korea, you never pour a drink for yourself. You always wait for someone to do it for you. In Portugal, you never ask for salt and pepper because it means you distrust the cook. And one time when I was traveling in Europe, I got to hang out with this elderly guy. He was French, and he had been a general. And he told me about a time he was at a state dinner in China. And he said it was this incredible meal, just like one dish after another. He said he was completely maxed out. He didn't say maxed out. I'm not sure how he said that, but then the end, and then they brought out this incredible dish of rice that was in a perfect pyramid with like everything perfect. And he saw it, he thought, oh. So he took a spoon, he took a little bit to be kind. And it turned out that was sort of a ritual of like, this is too perfect, no one could touch this. And it was this huge gaffe that he had made, but he wasn't aware of the ritual. So we all have some rituals that we engage in. I was raised a Quaker, so we always had silence, a moment of silence before we ate. My aunt used to say it was just a way to get us to shut up for a minute. But there was something around that, and it's a very interesting reflection. Like, what are your rituals around food? And what rituals do you engage in that are not conscious? They're just sort of inherited. And are there any rituals that you might bring into a meal that might add just a little bit of awareness? I know for some people, again, just taking a moment to pause, or lighting a candle can be just a way of sort of stopping and pausing. And of course, it's the whole range of, really stopping before a meal and really looking at it and opening the senses and so forth. So we relate to food from the realm of survival all the way to the realm of art. And it's interesting how, just as in meditation, there are so many rituals we engage in that are just done out of habit. The classic is if you're doing the classic metta meditation, which is the loving kindness meditation. May you be happy, may you be free, may you feel strong. It's very, very heartfelt. But it's also possible to do it in a way that is completely disconnected. And I've certainly had times like, I've got to do my loving kindness meditation. May you be happy, may you know peace, may you be free from suffering. You see the ritual in prayer. You see all the empty ritual that's out there. So eating as a spiritual practice is, how can you engage with what's in front of you? And again, the engagement in mindfulness, as we did in that meditation, is you're engaging the senses. So it's around how can you slow down and bring yourself in direct contact with the senses as you eat. A challenging practice, a really challenging practice. So I walk the woods in Northern Virginia a lot, and particularly along the river. And a few years ago, they were putting a little bridge over a creek, and in the parks they obligated to do these archaeological digs before they do anything. So they had some crews there doing all these digs, and I got to check them out on a regular basis, and the evidence is abundant of these prehistoric cultures that lived here. They could find the evidence of fire pits and so forth. And so often when I'm just sort of walking walking the hills and walking the woods, just trying to imagine, how did someone survive, just off the land itself? And it's very interesting how, for the indigenous cultures, in the fall was harvest time. That's when there were nuts and there were seeds, there were greens. It was all about preparing for winter. Storing the nuts, drying the greens, drying the fish, drying the meat, and making pemmican. And pemmican is basically just taking pounding meat and with rendered fat and maybe putting in some berries, and that would store really, really well. So through the winter, eating really, really dense foods. And again, fat was key. Fat was prized because that's what kept your body going. So you can imagine, as cold as the spring has been, and you're just eating what you managed to save and store, you'd primarily be eating kind of the fat and dried meat and nuts and so forth. And then as spring comes, all the early sprouts. And so when you're eating a lot of the very, very early sprouts, and like the fiddleheads are going to start, they're just beginning to pop, which are the ferns. Before they open up, they're pretty tasty. But all the sprouts are really astringent, which is exactly what cleanses the body of the fats. And then moving into summer with the fresh greens and the fruits and the fresh meats and fats. And so it's very interesting to see how, when you're that close to the land, you're eating what's immediately available, and how perfect it is for storing fat and then clearing that out through the year. And just as in meditation, you can find one tradition and then find another tradition that tells you exactly the opposite. It can be enormously confusing. And of course, it's the same with food. Why does someone crave a steak and someone else craves a mango? And there are lots of different theories around that, but I think the macrobiotic theory has got a lot going for it, which is you eat what's in season and locally available, as your great-grandparents did. That's more of a natural diet. So if you're in New England, you're going to be eating denser foods than you would as if you were living in the islands in the Caribbean. We'd be eating much lighter food. And so it's a real question of really just sensing, do you instinctively know what's best for you? And just as in meditation, it's very easy to get lost in thought and get disconnected from the body. Eating as a spiritual practice is about coming back to the body itself, to really sense, what does this body need right now? And just as in meditation, the instructions are so simple. When you notice yourself lost in the cognitive, come back to the raw experience of here and now. Very, very simple. Just not easy to do at all. And food becomes the same mirror. So there are lots of theories around food and why you're drawn to the foods that you're drawn to. One is your genetics. If you're familiar with the blood type diet, it's very, very interesting that the oldest blood type on the planet is the type O, which is when basically you're hunting down an animal, killing it and eating it, and then looking for the next animal. And so you've got an excess of hydrochloric acid, so you can digest meat really, really well. You need lots of proteins. And type O folks get really, really irritable when they don't have food in front of them. And then as we evolved and we started growing more food, became more pastoral, then we naturally started growing more grains, and that evolved into type A, which can be a little bit less focused on the denser proteins. And then there's a type B that can kind of eat everything. And that the origins of that tend to be more from the Middle East. So your genetics play into your optimal diet, and they can play into the natural way you feel drawn to eat. It was interesting. Thomas Jefferson, his blood type was type A, and he would talk a lot about how he didn't like eating meat. He would like it as a broth, which is sort of a natural thing. So, would you get a steak and a potato, or would you get a Caesar salad with some meat? So that's an interesting thing. Looking at how you metabolize, your particular metabolism, because you're always seeking the ratio of fats to carbohydrates to protein. And it's different for every one of us. Some people metabolize carbohydrates really well, others not so much. So the self-awareness that you develop will be your own guide toward what is most natural for you. And so the basic punchline here is that just as with a meditation practice or a spiritual practice, there's a lot of information out there. A lot of people telling you this is the way. But you have to find it for yourself. In that same way, with all the confusion around food and diet and optimal health, the only resource you really have will be you. And it's an interesting thing of how, just like when you go on a meditation retreat, or you step away to go on a retreat and do things completely differently, how it kind of reinforms you. It can also be helpful to really look at how you relate to food in that same way as well. And one particular approach that many people find helpful as a way of dialing up the feedback of how you relate to food is a process of just very consciously going through an elimination diet. My brother went through this recently, and my brother loves all food. His wife kind of convinced him to engage into this. And basically how it works is you'll go for, you have your regular diet, but then you'll take out one food group. And so like the first week, you eliminate sugar. And then the next week, you eliminate hydrogenated oils. And then the next week, you eliminate sort of processed grains. And then if you want to keep going, the next week you might eliminate dairy products. And then the next week you might eliminate red meat. And so you're kind of systematically kind of removing things from the diet that you're habituated to. He didn't want to do it. But to be a good sport, he did. And he was telling me about week 3, we was walking downstairs and in the morning, and he thought, hey, wait a minute. Where did my aches and pains go? And he was really quite floored by that. And then they all went out for a pasta dinner, I think after about a month, and he just felt horrible. And suddenly he could really see clearly, the foods that work for him and the foods that don't. So it's a very interesting experiment, if nothing else, just to explore if you were to step away from a particular food type for a week, what would that be like? And many people have found that to be helpful. Because just as in the practice of mindfulness, we rely on the body, in that same way, it can be a way of heightening awareness of your body and really recognizing how anything you eat will have 3 consequences. It'll either give you energy and enliven you, it'll in some way deplete you, or it'll be neutral. So it's really about body awareness. And it's interesting as well how with all of my experience with diet and supervising fast for years in the ashram where I lived, how really seeing how so many of our diseases in our culture are diseases of excess. And what can happen when you step away from habitual food. So there's a story I wanted to share with you that still gives me goosebumps. I had the opportunity to spend 6 months at a Living Foods Institute. It's called the Ann Wigmore Institute. Ann Wigmore was one of the very first pioneers in living foods and sprouting and so forth. And so a number of her devotees created this Living Foods Institute right on the west coast of Puerto Rico. And so I went there ostensibly for just 6 weeks doing kind of a work exchange to help them with some marketing, but they went through some tragedies in their culture, and so I stayed for 6 months. So for 6 months I ate no foods cooked more than 112 degrees and did 6 high colonics during that time. And it is an amazing place, and Leola and Lalita are the co-directors, and they're really amazing folks. But I got to watch people come and engage into eating living foods. So that included fermented foods and raw foods and so forth. And there was this one particular instance, and again, they would come for like 10 days and learn everything that would go with it. So most people come and go through their cleansing, their healing crisis, and be much lighter. But there was one couple that came. She was partially blind, and he, you could just tell there was something dramatically wrong with him. You could tell he was really, really bright, but there were some neurological issues that he had, and I couldn't help but want to get to know this couple better. And you could tell this guy really had gumption. He was born in poverty, and the military was his way up and out of his culture. And in the Army, he got 2 advanced degrees, one in chemical engineering. I forget what the other one was. And his job was as an instructor in Vietnam, instructing how to mix Agent Orange. So if you're not familiar with Agent Orange, it is a defoliant that was sprayed over massive, massive acres. And because it would knock the leaves off the trees, they could see where the enemy was and so forth. And in Vietnam, there are massive birth defects from Agent Orange. And here he was for many, many years instructing people how to work with it. He had a hard time walking. He walked with a shuffle, with his head down. And what was so painful was it was almost as if you could see that his mind was functioning, but he couldn't link it up to speech. So they stayed for a month. They did two rounds of the colonics and so forth. And at the end of the 2 weeks, we had a graduation, and he walked. He still couldn't speak, but he walked right over to me, upright, shook my hand, and in that eye contact, there was just that sense of, I see you. The healing in that was extraordinary. So food really can be medicine. Food can be a way that can make you feel more alive. And part of the practice is really, again, what mindfulness calls for is ruthless self-evaluation. When you're engaging into a spiritual discipline, the instruction is give yourself to it fully and then ruthlessly evaluate. Did this result in a more wholesome state or a less wholesome state? And it's that same requirement when you explore eating as a spiritual practice. So just as in meditation, the good news is you become more sensitive. The bad news is you become more sensitive. It's the same way with nutrition. And it doesn't seem fair to me. You think, when you really clean out, you'd be able to digest everything, and that's not really so. You just get more feedback more quickly about what doesn't work. So, an interesting element that comes up is how do we relate to the rest of the world in our diet? One is to find a diet that gives you optimum health, optimum vibrancy, where you are at like peak wellness, really honoring your body as a temple. But again, it's not just about you, it's about the rest of the planet. So a few words on this. There's a big case, for exploring a vegetarian diet. It's not right for everyone. Joseph Campbell was an avowed carnivore. When someone confronted him on that, he once said, "How do you think a carrot feels when a vegetarian walks by?" But there is this precept that is part of Buddhist practice, and that is to do no harm, to refrain from killing. And so how do we engage in that in a mindful way? The Tibetans, the Tibetan practitioners who live at high elevations, there are no vegetables. So meat and butter is very much a part of their culture. It's very much how they survive. So they have rituals around really honoring where their nutrition comes from. And they have certain rituals of how they won't directly kill an animal, but that's another little subset of that. So it's always been a real question for me. I grew up on a farm. I was raised in a gun culture. When you're raised in a gun culture, you're sort of given a gun at a certain age. Then at the next age, you're given the next more powerful gun. So I may be a wimp, but I remember when I was maybe 12, I had my rifle, and I killed a frog. And I felt so terrible. I felt so horrified about it. I just lost interest right there. And I would go hunting with my father and my brothers, but I never shot at anything. But what I did enjoy about the macho life growing up on a farm was running big tractors and all of that equipment. And in college, I was part of running a farm. We ran 1,000 acres, and I was the livestock manager of 500 hogs. And I loved the birthing time. We'd have about 125 pigs every 4 months. So pulling pigs and cutting their eye teeth and spraying their navels with iodine and doing everything I could to keep them as healthy as possible. And then when they got bigger, we would wean them from the sows, and then they would go out to the feeding barn where we would finish them. And I love caring for the animals. Even I'd have to castrate the males, which became so ritual I never thought about it. But there was the one memory that really haunts me is the first time I had to take the hogs to market. And it didn't even occur to me really that that's what we were doing. So these animals that I had really cared for, packed them really tight onto the truck, a big truck, and then drove them up to Jones Dairy. This was in Wisconsin, and backed it up. And then there were guys there with cattle prods. And to see the animals in that much fear, really terror, just to hear their cries of terror as they were moved from this very, very safe environment, onto an open air truck, and suddenly, pretty brutally moved down. And just the sounds in the abattoir were really, really haunting. And also growing up on a farm of, death is a natural part of things. But and this, I don't bring this up in any way to guilt trip you, but it really becomes a question of eating as a spiritual practice and contemplating what it means to do no harm. And I'm really sensitive about bringing this up because I have my family who are hunters and who are farmers and those who live in farm communities where this is their livelihood. This is what they do, and they do it well, and they're proud of what they do. And I imagine they see me as being smug and self-righteous. Maybe I am. And animals can be raised in a way that can be conscious, and I'm all for it. And also to say there are many, many acres that are not suitable for farming. They're really more suitable for grazing. So that's part of it too. But I realize for myself, I really want to minimize suffering in the world. And that includes what I eat. And with this general leveling up throughout our culture, with more cultures becoming more wealthy, there is a lot of pressure now for more animal products. And the effect on the planet is pretty scary. Just a couple facts from the internet, so they're true. Animal agriculture is responsible for more greenhouse gas emissions than all transportation combined. You'd save more, this one really got me. You'd save more water by not eating 1 pound of meat than by not taking a shower for 6 months. The conservative estimate is 2,500 gallons of water for 1 pound of beef. Half of all water in the United States goes to raising farm animals. Intensive farming is a major factor in the decline of various species. 7 football fields of land are bulldozed every minute to create more land for raising animals. And cows produce 150 billion gallons of methane every day. Here's another factoid, which I hope you forget. 89,000 pounds of excrement per second. But the effect on groundwater is extraordinary. So then the question becomes, what are the options? And one, of course, is to eat less animal products. At my organic market, I get this fake bacon. I get tempeh bacon. And the cashier said, "So how do you like that stuff?" And I said, "Well, if you pinch your nose and hold your breath, it looks like bacon." But actually, there are some amazing products coming on. Really extraordinary, huge amount of research now. They've actually come up with a burger now where they actually have grated beets in the burger, so it actually bleeds when you cook it. And they found, because the whole thing around burgers is mouthfeel, the way it's that comfort mouthfeel. So they found a way to inject globules of coconut oil into the burger, so it actually tastes like a burger. It's pretty cool. And what's amazing now, and again, if you walk through, a high-end, right now, unfortunately, a high-end store, how the substitutes for meat and dairy are really quite extraordinary. Yogurt, really, really good cheeses, and so forth. So it really is an interesting question to ask, is it possible to substitute? It doesn't have to be a full-blown thing, but again, just as you reflect. And I have to say that the thing that is really, what I've tried before is, I did that 6-month living foods thing. I thought this so fits with my philosophy, and I found out if I kept doing that, I'd be dead. It just did not work for my body of too high a metabolism or something. But I'm really happy to say after, I think it's been 4 or 5 years that I've not eating meat or dairy products, I feel better than I felt in a really, really long time. And it's interesting to see that I really think we're really seeing it reflected in our culture now, how much more available these foods are. There's a list of fast food restaurants now where you can get vegan food. 2 summers ago, I was in Paris with 2 meat-loving maniacs, and I actually managed to be vegan in Paris, which may have been a crazy thing to try. So I've been a food fundamentalist in the past. I think I've moved beyond that, and I'm not 100% vegan myself. I do eat eggs. I try to get them raised as consciously as possible. And after looking at all the research out there, I've been taking fish oil, which I think has had a really, really good effect for me, cognitively and so forth. So what we really need to reflect on in our life is, again, really evaluating what brings you to the greatest sense of aliveness in your life. What are you engaging in that enlivens you and lights you up? What are you engaging in your life that depletes you in some way? And in that same way, if you explore eating as a spiritual practice, to really sense, what am I just doing unconsciously? What in my diet is just what I do out of ritual? How can I make it more alive? How can I really tune into the wisdom of my own body to give me the feedback of what my path is? And then to pause and ask, how are my actions affecting others? What is the effect of how I eat in relationship to the rest of the world? And no one knows what your path is better than you when you pause and you sincerely inquire for yourself. So, thank you for letting me rant on that topic. It's a really juicy one. It's not only, again, as I mentioned last week, it's not only what you eat, it's how you eat it, which again is so critical. Is there anything that you can change in how you eat that might cultivate more of a sense of celebration? I'm going to throw online a little meditation on conscious eating, if you'd like to check it out. There's some cool little reflections you can do before you eat. Just sort of like, again, opening the senses and sensing the four elements in the food you're eating and reflecting on intention. So I found those to be helpful. And you do have the opportunity to engage into a conscious eating experience, which is the cookies coming up in a couple minutes. So, before then, a few announcements before we close. Jennifer Stanley, Jennifer, you here? Oh, can you stand up and wave? Jennifer and Jeff lead a course in mindful self-compassion, and you actually do a conscious eating experience in that. And you use a mango and chocolate and bacon, right? Oh, ginger. Yeah, sorry. No bacon. Also, I wanted you to know that the third annual IMCW Spring Family Mindfulness Day is on April 29th. So it's open to parents, grandparents, and kids. It's a really nice way to connect with family. Also, just to thank you for your support for the class and for IMCW and for the church. And if you'd like to be on the mailing list, you can sign up in the back as well.